Hey everyone, I'm Sanchita Agarwal. I work as an Android engineer at a company called Obvious.in. It's a design studio which is based out of Bangalore in India. And yes, I travel 24 hours to speak here, so bear with me if you can. So today I'll be talking about a very simple yet powerful concept in Kotlin, which is called sealed classes. I'm pretty sure if you have been doing Kotlin for a while, you would have heard of it or used it. And I would be trying to explain how can we leverage its power to minimize complexities within our app. So let's get started. Simple.org is the project that I'm working on currently. It's an open source project, and most of the examples that I'll be showing going forward are taken from this particular project. So what should you expect from my talk? Number one, how to deal with failures. This may seem more obvious, but more often than not, we don't deal with failures properly within our apps. And I'll be talking a lot about this. And number two, how can we model UI states so that we can simplify rendering of different view states within our app? So let's begin with something familiar. Whoops. We have seen one of these failure screens at some point in our lifetime. And as Android engineers, we have even built them. The problem here is not that we show failures to our users. The problem is that sometimes we overuse these screens as catch-all error screens to show failures or to not accept failures within our code flows. So what is a failure? I will try and explain this through a simple example. I want to build this super simple application where it's basically a login page where I enter the username, I enter the password, I hit login, and I should take the user to the home screen if it's successful. So how would the code for this look like? I create a button, I set a click listener on it, I make a call, which is login, I send in the username and password, and this should basically do the work for me. So what does login method look like? So first, I want my login method to make a login API call. Second, I wanted to parse the response that I receive. Third, if it's successful, then I would like to save the user data that I receive. And fourth, I would actually like to take the user to the home screen. So these are the four things that I would try and implement. And by doing this, we will gradually understand what I mean by failures. So let's start. Number one, I make a simple API request where I pass in the username and password. Number two, if the response is successful, I actually save the token, which is the login token, the auth token, sorry. And number four, I actually take the user to the home screen. Very simple, very basic. This is what a login method would do. I run this code, and I see what happens. I click on the login button. I click again and again. You can see my frustration by the bad click design that I've put here. But I check the logs, and turns out that the APIs are not ready yet, and I'm getting a 404. That's all okay, but why is my UI acting up? The reason being that I'm only handling a successful case. What happens if my response fails, right? This brings us to something that one of the most influential designers of our times, Jacob Nielsen, said. The very worst error messages are those that don't exist. The worst that we can do to our users is not showing them errors, right? So let's try and fix this and add that feedback for our users. So I add an else case, and I show error dialogues to our users saying that our servers are down at the moment. Everything is fine, I run it again, it works. I send the app for QA, and they report back after a while. Turns out that the app is crashing. I check the logs again, and there's an IO exception on this line number. Any guesses? Well, this is where I'm making an API call, and because Kotlin compiler doesn't show checked exceptions, I did not notice this. Why did I not think of this before? Well, as developers, this happens a lot. So for the time being, I fix this, and I add a try-catch block. I think that everything is fixed now, and I'm done for the day. I send it to QA again, and I go home. Next day, I enter office, and something else is an issue. QA reports back and says that there's an issue with our build. How often has this happened with us? That it works the night before, but the next morning when you come in, something else breaks. Well, it turns out that our QA were testing in airplane mode. Yes. Our servers are down is a dialog which shows irrespective of whatever error that API call was throwing. So in our case, it was throwing a network error, but we ended up showing it as our servers are down. Well, this brings us to our mistake number 2, which was a catch-all error screen. And this is our catch-all error dialog here. So let's try and fix our mistake number 2. I break down the response code into the different kinds of errors that I would actually want to show my users so that they can do or act on them appropriately, right? So I pray and run this code, and this time, just as a stress testing, I enter an incorrect username, right? And I see what happens. This doesn't work. What happens is that the user is actually taken to the home screen. What's broken? Well, API contract. Unconfirmed reports suggest that there may have been a breakdown in communication. And this happens all the time. The backend and the front-end teams don't communicate enough, and they change the contract and they don't inform the front-end teams, right? So what happens is that in case of incorrect credentials, they actually send you a successful 200, but instead of sending an auth token, they send you an error message. Well, we didn't think of it. So this is the piece of code where I'm assuming that if the response is successful, it means that I'm logged in, whereas that's not true. So I fix this piece of code, and let's just focus here, and let's try and fix this. So what I do is that I check if I'm receiving an auth token, and only then should I consider that a success. Otherwise, I show the error dialog and show the error that the server sent me. And this is what I do. Otherwise, I actually save the token and show the home screen, right? So this is how I fix this piece of code. This is another failure handled right there. Sun is shining again, and everything is good until it's not. We thought that we have fixed everything, and we sent our app to production, and now the users are reporting crashes. Yes. When we thought that a particular variable can never be null, well, guess what? So turns out that in this particular place, data can sometimes be null. Basically, the server can not send you data at all. So if there's anything that we have learned so far by looking at this example, it's this, that you cannot take things for granted. And as developers, failures cannot be an afterthought for us. We cannot go on building like this, possibly, right? So if we look at what we have built so far, this is what we've implemented in Login. And if we try and note down a list of problems that we have faced while building this, well, problem number 1, we did a really poor job at handling failures. Failures were always thought as we received crashes or as we received error messages, right? Second, our code is extremely hard to maintain because there's a lot happening there. And third, the single login method is doing a lot, and that needs to change, right? So let's begin with actually separating concerns, and if this is the 4 things that I expect my login method to do, let's try and make it do only 2 of those things. So let's try and make a login request and parse the login response, and leave the rest to somewhere else. So if I just focus on doing these 2 things, let's try and refactor the existing code that we wrote. So these are the places where I'm actually doing a bit of a UI work, and I want to separate all of this out. So what I do is that I create a wrapper class, say login failure. And this class basically encapsulates every information which is required for a login failure handling, right? And I replace all of that show error dialog with this wrapper class. Next, I do the same thing for success as well. So I replace both of these things which I'm supposed to do for success by a simple wrapper class which is called login success. And here I pass in the token, which is the data that needs to be saved, right? and I replace it back into the code. So these are two wrapper classes that I've created, login success and login failure. Now, this basically gives you two advantages. Number one, that there's a clear abstraction. Your UI will only understand login success and login failure. It doesn't need to know anything else. And it basically gives you better readability of the possible outcomes of a network call or of a login call, right? So just by looking at these two, we can say, okay, these are the only two possible outcomes of this method, right? So let's try and create like an interface called login result, which we can eventually return from that method, right? So I simply wrap these two classes around in a login result, and I make my login function return this login result, right? And now login result is like a bridge between the UI and this API call. Let's simplify it, call it success and failure, and ta-da, this is what we get. So now, as you can see, a lot of the implementation details around handling the response has been encapsulated into these two classes, right? I return this whole block, and this is the final thing that I receive after separating out concerns and basically splitting this method to do only just the bit about making the API call and handling the response, right? But we are not there yet. So one of the problems that we have solved so far is multiple responsibilities. So now coming back to failure handling itself and just focusing on that. We clearly added failures as we went, and that led to large feedback cycles for us as developers, right? So what do we do now? Well, a wise woman once said that failures need to be treated as first-class citizens. What this essentially means is that success doesn't mean just landing people on the moon. It also means bringing them back home safely, right? And that's our users. We can't just leave them, hanging dry and just thinking that, okay, the only scenario where I'm going to actually show them something is success. We actually need to stop penalizing them for their mistakes and show them proper error messages wherever we can. So let's try and do that. So these are the possible failures that I have captured so far in my logging method. And let's try and do a better job at treating failures as first-class citizens, right? So one thing that I can do on top of my head is replace all of this through enums, maybe? Yes. So that way, if I replace all my failures with enums, I now have a single class which has all the possible different kinds of failures. And now I can actually remember handling all of these failures. And plus, it's easier to comprehend, right? So I create this simple enum class, which is called failures, and I plug it back into my code. And you can see that login method now doesn't have to care about what is the specific error message that needs to be shown in case of invalid user or in case of connection error, because login doesn't need to know all of those details. But you notice that there are clearly errors here, right? And the reason there are compilation errors here is because it expects me to return a login result. And these are all failures, right? This, basically. So what I do is that I do the same thing for success. Now I need to replace success also as an enum. So I quickly do this. I create, instead of failures, I call this enum login result, and I basically put all the possible outcomes of a login result in this one enum class. But you'd notice that if I plug this back in, it's not going to work. Clearly, because enums don't allow you to pass in state unless it's common across all the values of enums. So this brings us to the disadvantages of using enums. Number one, they cannot carry state, right? And number two, they're restricted to just being values. What we essentially need is the restriction of enums and the goodness of a class combined together. And that will solve our problems, right? Enter sealed classes. Yes, this is exactly what the talk is about. So what are sealed classes? Sealed classes represent restricted class hierarchies. A value can have one of the types from a limited set, but cannot have any other type. What this essentially means is, through an example, if a sealed class is of type shape, it can only either be a triangle, circle, or a rectangle, and nothing else. And that's something that sealed classes itself ensures. So basically, they are an extension of enum, but in a way, because now sealed classes are also classes, you can have multiple instances of them, right? And that can obviously contain state. So if I go back and replace my login result from being an enum to being a sealed class, this is what it looks like. And just in a bit, I'll show you how can we actually leverage using sealed classes by inserting state in all of these different types, right? So number one, in case of success, now I can actually pass in data, whereas, and also convert it into a data class. Whereas in case of invalid user and connection error, I don't really need to pass in anything, so it can be a simple object class. Then for server error, I need to pass in some message, so I pass in an error. And for unexpected errors, similarly, I need to pass in, say, code maybe. And same for network exception, I pass in the exception itself, right? And this is what I get in the end. So this is what my final outcome of using a sealed class looks like. This way, all your possible outcomes are in one place. And other thing is that it makes you reason as to what all can be added as a possible outcome as well. So one of the things that we did by using sealed classes is that we did a better job at handling failures. Because while we are building, we can actually think, okay, that a login call can either be successful or fail. And if it's failed, what are the different kinds of failures that we can see? And in a bit, you'll also see how easy is it to maintain this. So if I now go back and plug in my sealed classes into this final method, this is what it looks like. And the good thing is that now you can reuse login wherever you want. So it doesn't have to know the context where it's being used. So these are the 3 problems that I've solved so far. And the advantages that you get of using a sealed classes, number one, I have spoken about this a lot already, all possible results in one place, which essentially means that just by looking at this simple class, login result, you're like, oh, I mean, as a new developer, if you're joining your team, you can just see, oh, this is the expected, these are the 7 or 8 outcomes of login result that I'm expected to handle, right? Number 2, it helps you think of all the outcomes. So if there's anything else that needs to be added here, for instance, say what happens if the user attempts more than 3 times and fails, then its account should be logged. And it's very simple. You can just go and add this outcome here and it works. And your feedback cycle reduces. And number 3, it's easier to perform different actions. So when I eventually end up handling the response that I get from the login call, I can actually split this into different cases and take care of them individually. So for instance, in case of success, I save the token and show home screen. And in case of connection error, I show an error dialog, and so on. So these are the advantages that we saw so far of sealed classes. And this brings us to life lesson number 1. Failure is not the opposite of success, it's part of it. I know that this is a life lesson because this also applies to our lives, but in our case, this applies to sealed classes a lot. I mean, sealed classes actually help you achieve this a lot because, for instance, in our current app, we use sealed classes extensively, and it actually helps us think about all the possible outcomes of any call, of any API call that we are building new into the app. So I've been talking a lot. I'll just take a break. So moving on, let's look at another broken user experience that can be fixed. This doesn't look right, does it? I don't think so. It's a confusing UI. I mean, what is this sorcery? I'm not supposed to show a loader on top of a search result, right? Let's rewind a bit. So I set out to build this very simple application where if I enter a movie name and I click on find, I should be able to just look up an IMDb database or something and get a list of all the matching movies, right? This is what I was expected to do. So I enter the name of the movie and it shows me the possible list of outcomes, right? Let's start building this. So we have a search button. I hit set on click listener on that, and I get the search string and I search the movie by using that string. Clearly, this is not a problem. This is a very simple piece of code. Let's dig deeper. Well, search movie, we'll do the same things that we did in the first example, where we'll try and implement search movie and see what happens. Let the search begin. Number 1, I need to show a loading bar as soon as you hit search. Number 2, I need to search the movie names in the database. Number 3, I hide the loading bar. Number 4, I either show the movie results or I show an error. Remember, error, yes. So I start implementing these things one at a time. I show the loading bar. I search for the movie title. I handle callbacks on that search result, either success or error. If it's success, I hide the loading bar and show movie results, which is this. And if it's error, I hide the loading bar again and show error. And this is finally what my search movie looks like. We run this and test. Everything works. Great. Now let's try and add some new features to this. What about swipe to refresh? So I know that everybody knows what swipe to refresh is, but just a refresher. You pull down the list and it basically does a reload of the list and refreshes the results that you receive. That's very simple, and this is what we want to implement. So if you look at what we have implemented, what we want to do out of swipe to refresh is essentially this part, where I should be able to make the search call again, right? So the business logic remains the same, except there's a teeny tiny problem. This. In case of a normal search, I want to show a loading bar. Whereas in case of a refresh, swipe to refresh, I want to show a refresh icon there, right? So this brings us to possible problem number 1 in our existing code, which is our business logic is mixed with the UI, and that leads to code reusability issues. Let's keep calm and copy-paste. Well, I create a similar method, which is called refresh this time, and which is basically a copy of search movie, except for the UI bits of it, which is I now replace show loading bar with showing refresh icon. Cool. Now I basically have 2 functions which do the exact same thing. So what happens next? What if a client comes to you and they say, we want to sort movies by release date? Well, if only this was possible. If only we could freeze our requirements like this. But we know that changing requirements are a reality of software development, and we need to deal with it. So what we do is that we quickly make this change where we sort the movies by date and push the code, and we're like, good to go. But aren't we forgetting something? What about refresh? Yes, we forgot to change it in refresh. This brings us to possible problem number 2, which is even small changes become really hard to do. This is what happens when you do code duplication. But we are too deep into this now. So let's just, and release is around the corner probably. So let's just quickly change a refresh and sort the movies by date here, right? And we are done. We test this whole thing out, and now we send our app to the QA. Sometimes this happens. Remember this? Yes. How did we get here? Well, what happens is that the first time I search and say, for instance, I don't see any results, this is the screen that I will see. But what if I hit find again? This time, it actually did not hide the previous view state, and it showed the new state on top of the existing state. And this is how you reach the screen. So if you look at the code and see what we were doing, the moment you hit search, this method gets called, and the first thing it does is that it shows the loading bar without caring about the previous state, right? And we did not clear the previous state. So this brings us to our problem number 3, which is unpredictable UI states. And as a developer, I cannot be sure, just by looking at my code, that what is the view state that I should be expecting, right? So we try and fix this, we hide the error, and we show the loading bar, but I'm sure that this is not right. I need to do more to fix this. So let's go over our possible problems again and see how can we fix them one at a time. Number 1, our business logic was mixed with the UI. Number 2, it was hard to change and maintain code because of duplication. And number 3, we had unpredictable UI states, right? So the biggest challenge I see in all these 3 is probably the last point, which is unpredictable UI states, right? So let's try and fix this. So my search movie was doing all of these things, right? And let's try and approach this problem differently. So if I look at these 5 steps, These 4 steps are essentially my UI states, something that I'm going to actually show to my users, right? And this is the part which is unpredictable. So if I point this out in my code, these are those parts, the UI state parts. And the last part, the second point, which is about searching the movie name, is actually my business logic, which is this part, where I'm actually searching for the movie. So I need to separate these two things out. So I need to separate my business logic from my UI state. So what if I separate it out into a data class, for instance? So these are my UI states, and I separate it out into a data class called, say, search view state, and that captures my all possible view states that I need to cover to implement my search movie. And as you can see, this covers both loader and refresh at the same time. So what I do next is that I replace my showing of basically all the handling of UI with this data class. So if I go back to my code, this is what I do. I changed hiding of error and showing of loader with this state. And similarly, I did for success and for failure, right? But how do these get rendered into the UI? Well, I create a simple class called render, which takes in a state, and this basically is responsible for showing the UI to the user. So I replace all of these calls with the render function, and eventually this is what it looks like. So I was able to a certain extent, fix the code duplication problem, because now I don't need to maintain both refresh and search. And second, I'm not sure if we can still predict the UI states, but we can at least make our code more maintainable now, because we don't have 2 places to change. So now let's look at the other side of our function, which is the render function. So what happens inside the render function, I handle these different states, which is show loader and show refresh. In that case, I show loading bar or showing refresh. And similarly, I do it for handling success and failure, which is movies and error. So moving on, let's see what I run this code, and I end up seeing this sometimes. And did I forget to hide something again? I guess, well, there was a part where I was supposed to handle a negative case where if the show loader is false, then I actually need to hide it, which I didn't do. So if I look at it, I still have my code, which is hard to maintain. I still have unpredictable UI state. So how do we fix this? Well, let's look at it a little differently now. If I look at all these 4 states, they are actually mutually exclusive. So when I'm showing my loader, I don't expect to care about showing movies or showing error. Similarly, when I'm showing movies or errors, I don't care about showing or hiding the error, or showing or hiding the loader, right? So all these states are mutually exclusive, and they shouldn't get affected by each other. So if I look at it, these 2 are fetching result state, whereas where I'm showing the data, it's the has data state, and the last is a has error state. And if only I can make all of these extremely explicit, because explicit is better than implicit, right? Well, enter sealed classes again. This time what I do is that I replace my search view data class with a sealed class. And now the simple sealed class will help us in getting that mutually exclusive states, right? So here I replace my loading state, basically the show loader and the show refresh icon, with this simple class called loading. And similarly for error, I have has error, and for data, I have has data. And this is what my final sealed class looks like. And as you can see, when I'm reading this out, I can tell that loading has nothing to do with has error, and has error has nothing to do with has data, right? And which is true essentially in this particular case. And if I go back and replace my existing code with the sealed class, this is what it looks like. It's extremely simple. And I just import it, and there you go. So we were able to make our code more readable and easier to maintain, right? But let's see if we're still able to fix the unpredictability of the UI states part. Well, this is what my render function ended up looking like while I was using a data class to do this. And what happens if I replace this entirely with sealed classes? So both these loading states actually point to the same view state, but I'm doing a lot to just get there, right? So let's replace this simply by a loading state and encapsulate all that needs to be done in a simple function called render loading state, right? And similarly for movies, I replace it by this. And for the part where I'm handling errors, I replace it by error. And this is what I get in the end. So this is a very simple way of handling view states when they are actually mutually exclusive. So just by reading this, we know that your UI state can only be in these 3 states, right, and nothing else. So as a developer, I can be sure that if I'm seeing something else, then there has to be something else which is wrong. So there is another advantage that I would want to point out by using sealed classes, which is one of the great things about it, which is the when block. When you use when block with sealed classes, it's magical, and I'll show you how. So if I want to add, say, a new state into my sealed class, which is, say, no data, for instance, then how would my code where I'm actually using this know about it? Well, there is a way to do this. If I have my when block here, and if I make my when block to be returned from here, it actually throws up an error if you have added a new type of sealed class, but you didn't handle it where you were using it, right? So the Kotlin compiler gives you this beautiful way of actually figuring out if this is happening, right? And now you can actually go and add this remaining branch, which is a no data branch, and you can handle it. So, this is a talk in itself, and I'm pretty sure people have talked about this before, but this was just like me giving you an overview of what happens when you use a when block with sealed classes. And this way we were able to handle all our problems, or the problems that I pointed out, using the sealed class. So the advantages that we saw in this particular example, number one, that we were able to achieve mutually exclusive states, which led to loser coupling, which is essentially this. And number two, similar and related things stayed together. So just by reading this, I know that loading in itself will carry everything which is required to be in the fetching result state, whereas data will capture everything that's required in the has data state, and same for error, right? So summing up, this is the final outcome of using sealed classes, and these are the few possible advantages that I have seen or experienced while using them. And sealed classes might seem like something which is very simple, and it is, but if you use it in the right places, they can turn out to be something very powerful. And sometimes we end up missing out on very simple concepts in a language, and we are not able to see how can they be helpful in the larger picture. And for me, sealed classes are that. And they do open your eyes to better designs and better feedback for developers. So this brings us to life lesson number 2 and the last lesson, which is the only constant in our life or the only constant in our code base is change, and we need to develop for change. And I will leave you with one of the quotes from Brett Victor, which talks about creators need an immediate connection to what they're creating. And in a very different kind of way, sealed classes give you that. And that's it. Thank you for listening in.
Thank you so much, Sanchita. Pardon?
Can I talk about a little bit about this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So this is the end of my talk, but I would like to talk about something which is very important and close to my heart. So I am from Bangalore, which is in India, and I run the small community of Android developers who are women, and it's a women-only meetup, but it's a nice space for women to actually catch up on, and it basically gives you a safe space to talk about things that you're not able to talk about in a larger crowd. And this is, I'm not sure if this happens all around the world, but in India, this is a problem where women sometimes feel isolated and they feel intimidated in larger groups. And this is one of the things that I do where we just get together, we're a bunch of 20, 30 odd women, and we talk about things that are challenging and how can we fix them and how can we actually navigate the tech space, which can sometimes be very lonely as a woman. Like, for most of my life, I have been the only woman in my team, and my team is probably like 10 to 20 people. So, I mean, no agenda here. I'm just talking about it because this is something which is very close to me, and you can follow us on Twitter. And if you know more women who are around you and who would like to chat up about this, I'm available after the talk and even tomorrow. Thank you so much.